The vast majority of episode titles in Adventure Time are pretty straightforward. A good chunk of them either come from a line in the episode, such as What Was Missing or Pahoy, or come from the subject of the episode, such as The Hall of Egress or Son of Ratbear. So as I've been rewatching the series this summer and watching many episodes for the first time in several years, I've been able to more or less know what to expect in each one, even if I don't quite remember the exact plot years later. The biggest exception to this rule, however, comes early in the show's third season, with Morituri te Salutamus, a title taken from a Latin phrase that roughly translates to, "We who are about to die salute you." And what follows this title was an episode that a younger me brushed aside as a good all-around Finn and Jake adventure, but the current me sees as a true early series gem, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. In this video, we're going to go through the episode and talk about how it uses some really clever hidden details to create a surprisingly dark background that recontextualizes Finn and Jake's endeavors with the Fight King.
It calls me forth.
Man, it's probably just puberty calling.
The beginning of the episode feels more like an ending, as Finn and Jake escape from a burger monster with tiny hedgehog creatures in an adventure that feels like it could have been its own episode. Besides the argument with Finn complaining about Jake's tendency to ignore his plans coming back later, this opening scene also reestablishes just how much the pair, and especially Finn, love adventures, which comes into play as they discover a coliseum filled with the sounds of fighting. While this episode could have very easily had Finn and Jake naively enter the Fight King's obvious trap, I love the joke of them figuring out that it's a trap, bailing, and then realizing how much fun it would be to fight their way out of it and doubling back. Anyway, back to the Fight King. His design is one of my favorites out of the one-off antagonists in the series, as his all-black design contrasts against the whites of the bandages and the greens of the background in his throne really well, and his comically large sword, complete with the phrase "to fight is to live" in runic code, is really sick too, making the character a nice mix of genuinely cool as well as hilariously over the top. Anyway, more on him later, but let's first talk about the fight against the first pair of gladiator ghosts that the king raises to fight Finn and Jake, and while we'll get to their really interesting dialogue and fascinating designs later, I do want to talk about the actual action first, which is surprisingly some of the grittiest and just best in the series. Despite being a show that features a lot of fights, Adventure Time has never been an action series, but you wouldn't know that from watching some of these scenes. The choreography isn't going to blow you away from a speed perspective, but the way that it illustrates the change in Finn's mindset as he goes from fight to fight is massively impressive, and the show uses the fact that his opponents are ghosts to let him become progressively brutal. I'm getting ahead of myself though, so back to the episode. After the first ghosts are defeated, the Fight King reveals that it's a multi-round affair, with the challengers being sent to the underground graveyard in between rounds, which while it is admittedly a pretty lazy way for the show to establish the dialogue fight cycle that it wants, it does give this episode time to focus on the conflict between Finn and Jake that serves as the emotional basis for the A-plot. Speaking of which, as I mentioned before, the main argument that really isn't between the pair is over Jake not wanting to follow Finn's plan of fighting the waves of ghosts and instead bailing to go and try to find a lava hula hoop. The reason that I call this an argument that really isn't is that besides an initial protest, Finn more or less just lets Jake go on his quest to turn the tomb into a tropical island while he hatches a different plan without his brother that isn't fully revealed to the audience until the end of the episode, as he creates a mud dummy Jake to go and fight with. Speaking of a tropical island, Jake's song is perhaps the most iconic part of the episode, and yeah, it is ridiculously catchy, so much though that you can probably guess one of the storyboarders for this episode. It also works well as something more light this episode can cut to in between Finn getting more and more bloodthirsty as he solos waves and waves of ghosts. The colors and music in this episode are much darker than a typical one in the series, which completely changes the vibe to something significantly more sinister as Finn's anger builds up, which the episode somewhat makes an effort to explain as a result of some kind of spell that the Fight King puts him under, but we'll get back to why that's likely not the case towards the end of the video. Anyway, as the episode tries to make as obvious as possible, going all the way back to the title card, the Gladiator showdown reaches its inevitable conclusion as the Fight King orders Finn to to fight against his mud companion, which Finn immediately does, driving a dagger into the fake Jake as the original emerges to watch, after determining that following his lava hula hoop plan won't exactly work out. Finn, noticing the real Jake and beginning to attack him, starts this really interesting and well done scene that becomes infinitely more fascinating upon rewatch and having the knowledge that Finn is faking this entire time. On a first watch of this episode, it's likely that you'll see Finn attacking Jake as a function of the Fight King's spell or whatever and not really question it. But upon rewatching it, or watching it a 4th, 5th, 6th, or however many times I've watched it in the last 2 weeks since my last video, you'll start to notice that this scene only makes sense if Finn isn't actually trying to kill Jake. Besides trying to pass off the Mud Jake as the real one to the Fight King first, he also takes some ridiculously weak swings at his brother, and for some reason refuses to strike at any part of his body besides his face, as he tries to give off the impression that the sword is simply too small to attack him, even though he could have very easily just cut into his body whenever during this fight. It's just a small detail that I really enjoyed while making this video. Anyway, I've already spoiled it, but once Finn makes it clear that he needs a bigger sword, the Fight King excitedly passes him his, which Finn immediately destroys, revealing both that he was never corrupted, and the Fight King's life force comes from his weapon, as he withers away once it's shattered. The pure amazement and horror in Jake as he realizes that Finn was willing to make him think that he was going to kill his brother just for his plan to work is hilarious, and there's a really sweet moment where Finn and Jake both assume that the pairs of murderous and eventually suicidal gladiator ghosts were the best of friends just like them, when the truth is actually quite the opposite. Wait, did I forget to talk about the murderous and eventually suicidal gladiator ghosts?
But now they're free.
Okay, yeah, obviously I'm going to talk about the ghosts, and while I do love the Finn and Jake stuff in this episode, and I'm going to tie everything back to it at the end of the video, the more interesting part of the episode is definitely linking together the clues and trying to figure out what's going on with the gladiator ghost. To start with the obvious, by the end of the episode, it's pretty clear that these are gladiators who, like Finn and Jake, enter the Colosseum as a pair, fought through the ghost, and eventually succumb to the order from the Fight King to strike down one another, as the ghosts constantly apologize to one another for betrayal, and in a ridiculously cool detail, all have wounds that match the weapon of their partner, which is easiest to see in the second fight between Priscus and Varys. This is a super cool background detail that makes this episode worth discussing all by itself, but it does beg a pretty big question, being how are both of these gladiators ghosts if one of them killed the other? Sure, it is conceivable that a fight could end with both sides having inflicted fatal wounds, and yes, it is conceivable that the Fight King just murdered the winner anyway, but I ultimately believe the answer is the most tragic, being the victor always committed suicide following their immense guilt, which brings a different meaning to the title of the episode, as the winner salutes their fallen friend before taking their own life. This is a conclusion that is again most indicated by the ghosts of Priscus being the clear loser with his head split open, and Varys, who has fairly limited wounds in comparison. While the former dies in a pretty standard way, with Finn sending him crotch first into his shield, Priscus actually wins the fight against Mud Jake before perishing anyway, as if the guilt was just too much for him.
Forgive me, Priscus.
The background story is partially so interesting because the show respects its audience enough to be able to understand its dark themes without ever explicitly explaining them, as it gives the Fight King and his Colosseum such an interesting atmosphere. But besides doing that, it also ties into Finn and Jake's plot, as it serves its role in fulfilling the series' long goal in portraying Finn and Jake as the perfect example of friendship, as they obviously contrast against the gladiator ghosts in that they are the first pair to get through the trap without killing one another. Getting back to the episode's central plot about Finn wanting Jake to stick to the plan, both characters actually benefit from their plan philosophy in this episode, as if Jake had stuck to his plan, he would have
Turn into a lava man.
and if Finn hadn't stuck to his plan, they never would have defeated the Fight King. But what Finn and Jake do that the Gladiator ghosts didn't is try and help each other through their plans. Jake's mission to get a molten hula hoop is because he wants to try and boost Finn's morale, and Finn makes Jake think he's gonna kill him so that he can try to get Jake out of harm's way. And while every other Gladiator inevitably gets caught up in trying to be the best fighter that they eventually turn on their partner, Finn and Jake show that the way to ultimately achieve your goals isn't to use your friends as a stepping stool, but instead to support one another. An example that ultimately allows the Gladiator ghosts to come together and finally move on to the dead world. Anyway, that's about it for me. Sorry if the conclusion to this one didn't exactly make sense, but I really want to talk about the ghost stuff from this episode and try to link it all together thematically the best that I could. Also, thank you so much to everybody who checked out my Clone High review. As while it did start pretty slowly views-wise, it's ultimately picked up quite nicely, so definitely look forward to more videos in that style. If you want to see what I'm working on next, or just see me tweet nice things about each episode of my adventures with Superman, you can find me on Twitter. But either way, this has been AmpleSamuel, and I'll see you in some undetermined amount of time with a video of an undetermined length about an undetermined topic. Thanks for watching.